He owned the building behind him. He owned 12 more like it across the city, glass towers with his name carved into brass plaques that no one bothered to read anymore. But on this particular night, in the cold, under a streetlight that flickered like it was struggling to stay alive, he was sitting on the sidewalk in front of one of them, a paper cup resting between his knees, asking strangers for spare change. No one knew who he really was. Not the men in tailored coats who stepped over him without a glance. Not the woman who would, without knowing it, change the entire course of his life. Because if she had known the truth that first night, she never would have stopped to help him at all. This is the story of a man who gave up everything he owned, if only for a month, just to find out whether anyone could still love him for nothing, and what happened when the one person who did found out exactly who he really was. Before we go any further into this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. His name was Ethan Hale, and by the time he turned 34, he had built one of the most recognizable real estate empires in the country. Hale Properties owned residential towers, office parks, and shopping centers stretched across 4 states, and Ethan's face had appeared often enough in business magazines that strangers sometimes stopped him on the street just to confirm it was really him. He had a driver who knew every shortcut in the city, an assistant who managed his calendar down to the minute, and a bank account that most people could not imagine even in their most ambitious dreams. And yet, somewhere beneath the achievements and the headlines, Ethan had become a man who trusted almost no one, because almost everyone who came close to him seemed to want something in return. It had not always been that way. Ethan's father had started the company with a single apartment building, and a loan he was terrified he would not be able to repay. Ethan remembered watching his father come home exhausted every night, his hands rough from doing half the repairs himself, because he could not yet afford to hire someone else. His father used to say that the day he stopped checking the numbers with his own eyes was the day he would lose everything. Ethan carried that lesson with him long after his father passed the company down. But somewhere between the growth of the business and the growth of his fortune, Ethan had also absorbed a colder lesson, one his father never intended to teach him. He learned that the bigger his name became, the harder it was to tell who actually liked him, and who simply liked what he could offer them. By the time he was in his early 30s, Ethan had stopped counting the number of dinners where a date recited details about his portfolio before ever asking about his childhood. He had stopped being surprised when old classmates suddenly reappeared in his life with business proposals disguised as friendship. Even his closest colleagues, the ones he trusted with decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars, rarely asked him how he was doing without somehow circling back to the company. Ethan began to feel like a walking asset rather than a person, something to be managed, courted, or extracted from, and the feeling grew heavier every year, until it became something he carried with him even into empty rooms. One evening, after a business dinner that had left him more drained than any negotiation ever had, Ethan sat alone in his penthouse office, staring down at the city below. The lights stretched out for miles, thousands of windows glowing with lives he knew nothing about. He wondered, not for the first time, what it would feel like to walk among those lights without his name attached to him, without the weight of everyone's expectations trailing behind him like a shadow. It was an idle thought at first, the kind of thing wealthy men sometimes say out loud without ever intending to follow through. But that night, for reasons even Ethan struggled to explain later, the thought refused to leave him alone. Over the following weeks, the idea took a firmer shape in his mind. He would disappear, not permanently, not recklessly, but deliberately and temporarily. He would remove every trace of Ethan Hale, the CEO, and see what remained of him without the company, the money, or the name. He told only one person, an old friend from college who now worked as his personal attorney, someone he trusted enough to keep his secret and handle the business in his absence. His friend thought the idea was reckless at best and dangerous at worst, and said so plainly, more than once. But Ethan had made up his mind. And there are certain kinds of loneliness that a man will do almost anything to escape, even if the escape looks irrational from the outside. He gave himself 30 days. He picked a neighborhood he owned property in, but rarely visited in person, a place with older buildings and modest apartments, far from the glass towers where his name was engraved above the entrance. He bought a torn jacket from a second-hand store, the kind of coat that had clearly survived more than one hard winter. He let his beard grow out for a week before he began, and he stopped cutting his hair on schedule. On the first night, he sat down on a sidewalk outside one of his own buildings, a paper cup placed in front of him, and waited to see what it felt like to be invisible in a city that once could not stop watching him. The first few days were harder than he expected, not because of the cold, though the cold was brutal, but because of how quickly people looked away. Ethan had spent years being noticed everywhere he went, and now he understood, for the first time, what it felt like to not exist in the eyes of strangers. Men in suits similar to the ones he used to wear stepped around him without breaking stride. Women pulled their bags a little closer as they passed. Children stared for a moment before their parents guided them along, whispering something Ethan could not quite hear. He had expected to feel humbled. He had not expected to feel quite so erased. It was on the fourth morning that he first noticed her. A woman came down the fire escape of the building across the street just after 6 in the morning, a broom in her hand, sweeping the entrance steps with the kind of practiced rhythm that suggested she had done this every single day for years. She wore a plain gray uniform with the cleaning company's logo stitched above the pocket, her hair pulled back tightly, her breath visible in the early morning cold. She glanced toward him once, then again, and on the third morning, she crossed the street entirely and knelt down in front of him with a thermos in her hands. Her name was Grace Whitman, and she was not the kind of person who overthought a small kindness before offering it. She simply saw a man shivering on a cold morning and decided, without hesitation, that she had a thermos of coffee she could share. She told him plainly that he was going to freeze out there if he did not get something warm in him soon, and she pressed the thermos into his hands without waiting for him to argue. Ethan, who had negotiated deals worth more money than Grace would likely see in several lifetimes, found himself unable to form a single coherent sentence in response. He simply nodded, took the coffee, and watched her walk back across the street to finish her shift. Grace worked as a cleaner for a commercial services company that contracted with several buildings downtown, including, though she did not know it, more than one building that Ethan himself owned. She had been doing this work for almost 6 years, arriving before dawn most mornings and often picking up extra shifts on the weekends. She was raising her son, a boy named Caleb, largely on her own, after his father had left when Caleb was still small. Grace rarely spoke about that chapter of her life, not out of shame, but because she had long since decided that dwelling on what had gone wrong left less room to focus on what still needed to go right for her son's sake. Grace's days were long and repetitive, in a way that would have exhausted most people, yet she rarely complained about it, at least not out loud. She cleaned offices before the executives arrived, rode 2 buses home, made sure Caleb had breakfast and got to school, then often returned for a second shift in the evenings. Her apartment was small, the walls covered in Caleb's drawings instead of expensive artwork, but it was warm, and it was hers, and to Grace, that mattered more than anything money could buy. She had one quiet dream she almost never spoke about, not even to her closest friends, a small bakery of her own, nothing extravagant, just a place where she could bake the recipes her grandmother had once taught her and watch people's faces light up when they took the first bite. After that first thermos of coffee, Grace began stopping by almost every morning before her shift began. She never asked the man on the sidewalk his name directly, and for reasons he could not entirely explain to himself, Ethan never offered it either. Instead, she brought him small things, a piece of bread wrapped in a napkin, an old blanket she had found in storage, a spare pair of gloves that had belonged to her brother. She never made a show of the giving, and she never lingered as if waiting for gratitude. She simply gave, the way some people cannot seem to help giving, even when they have very little to spare themselves. What surprised Ethan most in those early weeks was not the kindness itself, but how effortless it seemed to be for her. She talked to him the way she might talk to any neighbor, asking small questions about his day, complaining lightly about her aching feet after a long shift, telling him stories about Caleb's latest school project or the funny thing he had said at dinner the night before. She laughed easily, often at her own jokes before he had even fully processed them, and there was nothing performative in the way she carried herself. She was not trying to impress him. She had no reason to. As far as she knew, he had nothing to offer her in return. Ethan had shaken hands with senators, closed deals with foreign investors, and sat calmly through boardroom negotiations that determined the fate of thousands of jobs, all without his pulse changing in any noticeable way. And yet here he was, undone entirely by a woman offering him coffee and bread on a freezing sidewalk, expecting absolutely nothing in return. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan felt like he was being seen not for what he could provide, but simply for who he appeared to be in that moment. A cold, tired stranger who needed a little warmth. It was, in its own quiet way, the most honest connection he had experienced in years. As the days passed, Ethan began to look forward to those early mornings more than he wanted to admit. He found himself waking before dawn, not because the cold kept him from sleeping, though it often did, but because he did not want to miss the sound of Grace's footsteps on the fire escape, or the particular way she called out a greeting before she even reached him. He learned the small details of her life the way friends slowly learn each other's stories, piece by piece, without either of them treating the conversation like an interview. He learned that Caleb wanted to be an astronaut one year and a chef the next. He learned that Grace's grandmother had taught her to bake bread from memory, without ever writing down a single recipe. There were nights during that month when the weather turned harsh enough that Ethan genuinely questioned whether he could last the full 30 days he had promised himself. On one particularly brutal night, when the temperature dropped low enough that his hands ached even under the blanket Grace had given him, she came out again, later than usual, and sat down on the curb beside him without a word. She did not offer advice or ask probing questions about how he had ended up there. She simply sat with him for nearly 20 minutes in the cold, her shoulder occasionally brushing his, so that he would not have to be alone with the worst of the night by himself. It was such a small gesture, and yet it struck Ethan harder than almost anything else that had happened to him in years. As the 30 days drew closer to their end, Ethan found himself facing a new kind of discomfort, one that had nothing to do with the cold, or the hunger, or the exhaustion of sleeping outside. He realized that he did not want this experiment to end the way he had originally planned it, with a quiet return to his old life and a private satisfaction that he had learned something valuable about human nature. He had not expected to develop real feelings for the woman who had shown him kindness without asking for anything in return, and yet here he was, counting down the days with a growing sense of dread rather than relief. He also understood, with increasing clarity, the risk he had created for himself. Grace had shown him a version of herself that was completely unguarded, precisely because she believed she had nothing to gain and nothing to lose in doing so. The moment she learned the truth, that the man she had been quietly caring for was, in fact, one of the wealthiest developers in the city, and that he owned not only the building she cleaned but several others besides, there was a very real possibility that she would feel deceived rather than flattered. Ethan turned this problem over in his mind for days, searching for a way to reveal the truth that would not immediately destroy the fragile trust that had formed between them. In the end, circumstances made the decision for him faster than he expected. With only a few days left in his 30-day experiment, Ethan's assistant contacted the cleaning contractor's office regarding an internal review of vendor agreements across the company's properties, a routine piece of business that Ethan had approved weeks earlier and largely forgotten about. As part of that review, several employees were asked to come in for individual meetings with senior leadership, and Grace's name appeared on that list simply because she had been with the company the longest. She had no idea, as she rode the elevator up to the top floor of Hale Tower that morning, that the man waiting for her behind the desk would be anyone other than a stranger in a suit reviewing employee files. When Grace stepped into the office and saw Ethan sitting behind a desk large enough to seat an entire family, dressed in a suit that fit him with the kind of precision only expensive tailoring can achieve, it took her several seconds to fully process what she was looking at. His face was the same face she had come to know so well over the past month, cleaner now, sharper somehow, but unmistakably the same man she had been bringing coffee to every morning before dawn. The recognition landed on her slowly, then all at once, and Grace felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the weather outside. She did not raise her voice. She did not make a scene in front of the assistant hovering near the door. She simply looked at him for a long moment, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to quiet devastation, and said the only thing that felt true in that moment, that he had let her feel sorry for him. Ethan tried to explain himself, tried to tell her that he had needed to know whether anyone could still treat him like a person rather than a paycheck, and that she had been the only one who had. But to Grace, standing there in her uniform in front of a man who had clearly never needed anyone's sympathy at all, The explanation sounded less like an apology and more like a confession that her kindness had been, without her knowledge or consent, turned into some kind of experiment. Grace left the office that day without accepting the flowers Ethan had arranged to have delivered, and without responding to the message he sent later that evening, apologizing again and asking for the chance to explain himself properly. For Grace, this was not simply about wounded pride. It was about the unsettling realization that a month of what she had believed were small, honest human connections had, in fact, occurred entirely within a lie. She had shared real details about her son, her hopes, her grief over her grandmother, all with a man who had been concealing an entire identity from her the whole time. It did not matter to her, at least not at first, that his intentions had not been malicious. What mattered was that she had been kept in the dark while he watched, evaluated, and eventually walked away with exactly the answer he had been looking for. In the weeks that followed, Ethan did not disappear the way he had before. He also did not overwhelm Grace with grand gestures or expensive apologies, having learned, at least this time, that the very performance he had used to win her trust in disguise was not the kind of performance that would win it back. Instead, he began showing up in small, consistent ways that had nothing to do with wealth or spectacle. He quietly arranged for a persistent leak in her apartment building to finally be repaired, something tenants had been requesting for over a year without success, though he made sure his name never appeared anywhere in the paperwork. He picked up Caleb from school on the one occasion Grace's shift ran unexpectedly long, having asked a mutual acquaintance for the school's pickup policy, rather than assuming Grace would simply forgive the intrusion. Grace noticed these small efforts, even as she kept her distance emotionally, still uncertain whether she could trust a man who had proven capable of hiding something as significant as his own identity for an entire month. She spoke to a close friend about it more than once, trying to work out whether her anger was really about the deception itself, or about the fear of being hurt again by someone who held so much more power in the situation than she did. Her friend reminded her that trust, once broken, does not usually return through grand declarations, but through the slow accumulation of small, unremarkable proof that someone has actually changed. Grace decided, cautiously, to give Ethan room to prove that, without promising him anything in return. Over the following weeks, Ethan continued showing up in ways that asked nothing of her. He never brought up money. He never suggested that his wealth could fix whatever damage had been done between them. Instead, he simply kept appearing, doing ordinary things, the way an ordinary neighbor might, without cameras, without an audience, without any indication that he expected credit for any of it. On more than one occasion, Grace caught sight of him from her apartment window helping an elderly neighbor carry groceries up the stairs, entirely unaware that she was watching, and something in her began to soften, not because the gesture was extraordinary, but precisely because it was not. It took nearly 2 months before Grace agreed to sit down with Ethan properly, not on a sidewalk, and not in a glass office on the top floor of a tower bearing his name, but at a small diner near her apartment, a place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that came in chipped mugs. Ethan arrived without his driver, without an assistant trailing behind him, and ordered the same cheap breakfast special Grace ordered, because for the first time since she had discovered the truth about him, he wanted her to see him choosing an ordinary life, rather than simply visiting it for research purposes. They talked for nearly 3 hours that morning, and for the first time since the truth had come out, Grace allowed herself to laugh in his presence again. It was not a single conversation that repaired what had been broken between them, but a slow accumulation of ordinary mornings, ordinary conversations, and ordinary choices that Ethan made, without ever expecting recognition for making them. Grace began to understand that the man sitting across from her in the diner booth was closer to the man she had met on the sidewalk than to the polished executive she had glimpsed behind the desk that first devastating day. He asked about Caleb's schoolwork without being prompted. He remembered small details about her grandmother's recipes that she had only mentioned once, weeks earlier, back when she believed she was simply talking to a stranger with nowhere else to go. One afternoon, nearly 4 months after Grace had discovered who Ethan really was, he asked her a question that had nothing to do with apologies or explanations. He asked her, plainly, whether she still thought about the bakery she had once mentioned to him on that freezing sidewalk, the one with her grandmother's recipes and no name attached to it yet beyond the idea in her head. Grace admitted that she still thought about it often. though she had long since accepted that between her cleaning shifts and raising Caleb, it would likely remain nothing more than an idea for the rest of her life. Ethan did not offer to fund it outright that day. He simply asked if she would ever consider it seriously if the circumstances were different, and Grace, cautiously, admitted that she would. What followed was not a single dramatic gesture, but a series of quiet, practical steps that Ethan insisted on handling with as little visibility as possible. He connected Grace with a small business consultant who specialized in first-time bakery owners, someone with no obvious ties back to Hale Properties. He offered to cover the initial lease on a small storefront a few blocks from her apartment, structured as a loan rather than a gift, because Grace had made it clear early on that she did not want to feel as though she owed her success to his money, rather than her own effort. Grace spent the following months working harder than she ever had before, splitting her time between her existing cleaning shifts and the slow, painstaking process of building a bakery from nothing but a family recipe and a stubborn refusal to fail. By the time the storefront finally opened, nearly a year after that first cold morning on the sidewalk, Grace had paid back a significant portion of the loan herself, insisting on handling the finances with the same discipline she brought to every other part of her life. The bakery was modest, tucked between a laundromat and a small hardware store, with a hand-painted sign above the door bearing her grandmother's name, rather than her own. On opening morning, Ethan stood quietly near the back of the small crowd that had gathered, not as the CEO of Hale Properties, but simply as a man watching someone he cared about finally step into the life she had once been too afraid to reach for. The two of them did not rush toward any grand romantic conclusion after that. Grace remained cautious for a long time, unwilling to fully hand over her trust simply because Ethan had followed through on a business arrangement. But over the following year, their relationship deepened in the same slow, deliberate way it had begun, built not on wealth or spectacle, but on the accumulation of small, consistent choices that neither of them made for show. Ethan learned to sit quietly in Grace's small apartment on ordinary evenings, helping Caleb with his homework at the kitchen table, without ever making Grace feel as though he was performing generosity, rather than simply living his life alongside hers. Nearly 2 years after that first freezing morning on the sidewalk outside one of his own buildings, Ethan and Grace were married, in a small ceremony that neither of them wanted turned into a public spectacle. There was no press release, no announcement in the business pages that had once tracked Ethan's every professional move. The wedding took place in a modest backyard belonging to one of Grace's oldest friends, with folding chairs borrowed from the very bakery Grace had built with her own hands, and a cake made not by an expensive caterer, but by Grace herself, using the same recipe her grandmother had once taught her from memory. Looking back, it would be easy to tell this story as a simple fairy tale, a wealthy man in disguise, a kind-hearted woman who deserved a reward for her generosity, and a happy ending that ties every loose thread together neatly. But the truth of what happened between Ethan and Grace was messier than that, built on a deception that genuinely hurt someone who had done nothing wrong, and repaired only through months of patient, unglamorous effort that offered no guarantee of success. Grace never fully forgot the sting of learning that a month of what she believed were honest connections had occurred inside a carefully constructed disguise, and she has said, in the years since, that forgiveness was a choice she made deliberately, not something that arrived automatically simply because the story eventually turned out well. There is a question worth sitting with here, one that does not have an easy answer. If Ethan's experiment had ended differently, if Grace had never learned to trust him again, would we still consider his decision to disappear for 30 days an act of honest self-discovery? Or would it simply be remembered as a wealthy man testing the emotions of someone with far less power than himself, without her knowledge or consent? The fact that this story ended in marriage does not erase the more uncomfortable truth sitting underneath it, that Grace never had the choice to decide whether she wanted to participate in Ethan's search for meaning in the first place. Her kindness was real. His need for connection was real, but the imbalance between them, in wealth, in power, in the ability to walk away consequence-free, remained real as well, even after the wedding, even after the bakery, even after 2 years of small, deliberate acts meant to rebuild what had been broken. Would you have forgiven a deception like this one, even knowing it eventually led somewhere good? Would you have recognized the early signs the way Grace eventually did? Or would you have walked away the moment you discovered the truth, unwilling to risk being hurt again by someone who held so much more power over the situation than you ever could? These are not easy questions, And there is no single right answer, only the uncomfortable reality that trust, once broken, rarely returns the same way it left, even when the person responsible spends years trying to earn it back one small, unremarkable act at a time.